Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast, where we're all about commander, data, and dad jokes. I'm Joey Schultz, and today I'm joined by the one, the only, the man who saw the upcoming card Smile at Death and smiled at Smile at Death. It's Matt Morgan.
So, Joey, I have a friend of mine. He just got a couple dogs recently. He called them Rolex, Timex, and Casio, and I thought that was kind of weird names, but he said, well, yeah, they're my watchdogs.
I should have been able to see that one coming. That is terrific. A+. I've gone past laughing and just like I've turned into professional appreciation for your jokes here, Matt.
Yeah, well, hopefully these watchdogs don't have too many ticks. Otherwise, that might backfire on them a little bit. But either way, they're all good dogs.
That is terrific. Well, hey, Matt, it's the two of us in this episode. What is it that we're discussing? What's going on in this one?
Well, we are here this week to tell everybody that they have too many decks. That's right. Everybody out there, you all have too many decks. You need to get rid of some of those decks. And we're going to help you maybe navigate that conversation with yourself on how do I get rid of some of these decks that I have.
Yes, exactly. This is a PSA to players to not be afraid of making big changes, because sometimes we do got to confront those big changes. But before we get into it, we've got a couple of shout outs that we want to do. First, this episode is brought to you by Dragon Shield. We can finally talk about it. We have our first batch of EDHRECast custom sleeves. We got to give these away at our panel in Chicago. The design is so cool. So keep an eye on Dragon Shield's website, which is linked in the description below if you want to click on that, because Dragon Shield will have more of these available in the coming weeks. Our new sleeves have been revealed over at Dragon Shield. Dana, I hope I did you proud with that rhyme.
And if you'd like to support the show, there's a lot of different ways you can do that. You can like this video on YouTube, subscribe over there. We're getting kind of close to 100,000 subscribers. We would love to hit that by the time we get to Vegas. Maybe we'll have some special Dragon Shield swag to give away, custom sleeves. I don't know. Hey. But if you would like to, you can head over to patreon.com/EDHRECast. There's a ton of perks over there. Maybe you want to get all these episodes a day early, including get in the running for the weekly patron shout out. So this week, we are going to give a very special shout out to Sean Gibb of the Gibb family fame, Staying Alive, Saturday Night Fever, the Bee Gees were the best. So Sean, thank you for all of your contributions from your family to just the world of disco music.
Yeah, we got to give it up to Sean.
Really got to give it up. Really got to.
Yeah. All right, Matt. Well, now we're getting into our topic here, which is you have too many decks. Everyone out there, you just do.
Everyone does.
You have too many decks. And this is true of me too, by the way. I just need to cop to that immediately.
I was going to say, everybody out there in listener land, there's at least 20% of everybody who instantly went into defense mode of, I don't have too many decks. 37, that's not too many decks. You, including you, if you need one of those Stanley boxes to bring all of your decks to an event, you have too many decks. I want to also be clear that like this sneaks up on you. I did not realize it but does. I've recently just realized that I have 20 decks in my commander roster. That's so many.
That's a lot. And I didn't even notice it happening. And like, that's the type of thing that we want to catch ourselves on. That is the point of this episode, is to be like, hey, let's make sure that we're actually honoring the stuff that we've built and the passion that we put into those, because at a certain point you're stretching yourself too thin. And that's what the point of this episode is making sure that we can hold ourselves accountable to the stuff that we actually enjoy about the game. Because when you have too many decks, it's hard to do that.
And it's not just hard to enjoy the game, but it's hard to enjoy all the decks that you spent time and energy and, in a lot of cases, money creating and crafting. And there's so many things that go into this, but it really does get away from you. I also got up to that 20 deck mark without even realizing, like, whether it was, okay, well, I got 4 of the precons from the Lord of the Rings set, and I kept all of those, and that adds up really quick. And if anybody out there buys precons, you probably have way surpassed this mark just by accident.
Yeah, totally. In the past, we've discussed like old decks that we took apart and why we took them apart, such as, I had a feather deck that was, for me, a little bit too linear in every single game. Yeah. Or Cardoor was one that I took apart because it wasn't necessarily so much fun for other people. So some of those, I think, make this process pretty easy to identify, that deck was not producing the effect that I wanted it to produce. But even having gone through that, I am still running into the situation where I have too many decks. So that's why, for me, this is a conversation that, like, if anything, y'all out there, I'm trying to convince myself to take some stuff apart so that I can focus on the things I really enjoy. So this conversation is just as much for me as it is for everybody else.
And it's really easy for us to give a lot of specifics on why we had any given deck that got taken apart, just because that we have that specific experience to point back to. It's a little bit harder, and hopefully this is why we're having this conversation, to shed light on the principles of how do you go about that and start that conversation with yourself, because you built those decks for a reason. You built a deck because you were excited about it. You want to do a strategy, try something new.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, like you get an emotional attachment. I know I have emotional attachment to a lot of decks.
Oh my God, totally. We do put a lot of ourselves into those decks. But then if we're not playing those decks after we've built them, that's the issue that we sometimes run into. And I think it is also it's good for us to encourage ourselves to take big actions sometimes. Like, yes, we did put a lot of energy into that, but maybe we can also find a lot of good lessons from the act of taking them apart too, and that's kind of what we're doing here. Real quick on this subject, I want to shout out that if y'all know Dan Sheehan of the Pie Break podcast out there,
Dan's great.
He made a great video about 2 years ago that is called Burn It Down. We'll link that in the description, where he describes an exercise that he does every year, taking apart literally every single commander deck that he has, unsleeving them, resorting them, like every card back into his collection, and any decks that he wants to play in the next year, he has to build again from the ground up. He does that every single year to keep himself appreciating the actual stuff that he brews and keep things feeling new for himself. I don't know if I'm going to go quite that far extreme, but it's a great video. Definitely check it out. And it's a good inspiration for this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And that exercise, I really like the idea of, because I would wager if I did that, if I unsleeved every single deck, I went back through and did that, boy, I don't know how many decks would come back together. That's really, truly something that when you do, and you're super intentional about it. That's one thing that I love about Dan is Dan's so intentional with his deck building, with his just thought processes going through everything. And I love the intentionality behind that. That's something that we talk about all the time when you're changing decks, when you're adding cards to decks, whatever. And so having that go into, do I get to keep the deck too? Such an amazing perspective that I hope everybody has a chance to listen to that episode, because it's so helpful.
And I want to focus in right there, Matt, you saying if you did go through all of that rigmarole of taking them apart, and how many would you actually put back together? The number doesn't seem high.
It's not high at all. No, it's not.
Yeah, I looked at my Architect roster and was looking through these, and there's so much joy that I put into every single one of these. But in terms of the decks that I would actually be like, it makes me uncomfortable to not have them. Like, I would actively feel bummed out if those cards were not actually like sitting in a deck box on my desk somewhere.
Yeah.
There's only like 3 or 4 where I'm just like, no, I need to actually have that put together. And the other ones, I think I could actually be a little bit more flexible with if I wanted to try out different stuff, or it might take me months before I actually play them again, that type of deal. And that's the type of like hard conversation to have with yourself that we want to confront here.
Yeah, and one thing that I want to make sure that we kind of set the bar at and have the expectation is, there's so much that goes into building decks and taking them apart. And just because you're taking a deck apart doesn't take away from the experiences you did have with the deck before you took it apart. I mean, it's kind of like a relationship. You're able to learn from those things just happening in general, even if you don't keep it forever. And so whether it's, I learned a lot building the deck, I challenged myself to make something out of my comfort zone, or it's, I've had some of the most fun experiences playing with my friends with this one deck. You still have those memories. You still have those experiences. So we definitely want to celebrate those, even though it might be time to take any given deck apart.
And you still have your deck list linked on architect.com. So if you do want to put it back together, you can still do that. It's super easy. It is technically a pretty low risk thing to do. And Matt, I love the point that you made there. That's something I want to get on a little bit, maybe in the latter half of this episode, talking about so many amazing benefits that can happen as a result of this, because like appreciating those lessons a deck taught you, that's a huge deal for me. But first, I think we might need to make the case at the beginning of this episode for people who are maybe still a little bit skeptical about whether they do have too many decks. Sure. I think we might need to dig into like, here are some reasons why this actually might be true of you, that there are a whole lot of decks in your collection. Let's start with the confrontation of ourselves part, I think.
Well, so I think the first lesson then that we need to get to is admitting that if you have more decks than you are feasibly able to play, whether you don't play very often or you just have truly that many decks. I know Brian Canada, he's somebody who has built a deck for every single commander, and it was feasible for a little bit. It's not feasible anymore.
No, it is not.
And so poor Brian, Brian wrote about that experience on EDHREC for a long, long time, but it's so wild. But you don't have to have a deck for every single commander to have too many decks.
Yes, absolutely. And a point that Dana really likes to make in this conversation that I want to bring in here, it isn't just that you have more decks that you can play. Sometimes you also have more decks that then you can remember to play well. If it's been a year since you played something, or even 8 months or whatever, you're not going to be as familiar with the lines of play and the cool synergies that exist in that deck because it's been a minute. So you're kind of spreading your own strategy a little bit too thin, and it takes a while during the game for you to remember how that deck is actually supposed to operate and what the best moves really are. And that kind of sacrifices some of the coolness that you feel during that game experience, and that can be a problem that you occasionally run into when you have so many of them.
Well, and you look at 60 card players too. There's people who are playing in Pro Tours and all that. Some of those people, you know, they maybe do well enough because they're able to play any given deck very well, so they can hop from best deck to best deck. But then you have those specialists, and you have those people who truly know any given archetype or strategy, and that's really where you gets to get so many bonus win percentage points out of any given deck that you're playing, because you have that familiarity. Like, Joey, an Aristocrats deck in your hands is very different than Aristocrats deck in my hands. It could be the exact same deck list, but you are just so much more familiar with those lines of play. I could look at it and say, I don't know what this deck is even trying to do. And you're like, oh no, it's a no-brainer. I obviously know what this does.
And kind of leaning into that too, I built a lot of Aristocrats decks. Like, well, I've got Conrad, I've got Rutstein, my Wilhelt occasionally doing some Aristocratsy stuff. It's an archetype I'm very familiar with and very eager to continue brewing, but I don't get to play every single one of those all of the time. So in that case, it's just like, oh, I love Aristocrats in like 8 different directions, and each one of those was a really fun brewing experience, but am I actually getting to play all of them? Not really. So at a certain point, would it make more sense for me to focus some of my attentions and to slim down? Maybe I don't need the Rutstein deck, etc., stuff like that. And the fact that you brewed it and the stuff that you learned from it, that can be the thing that you honor. It is so much fun. There are some decks that, like, Matt, let's be honest, they're more fun to tinker and to brainstorm and to brew than they are to play sometimes.
Yeah, for sure.
I feel like that's just sometimes a true fact of some commanders. And if you're building them and then they're just getting dust on your shelf, I think that we're kind of robbing ourselves a little bit of the passion that went into that project. So we don't need to feel obligated to keep it just because we brewed it. There are still lessons that can happen from the brewing event of it, rather than the potential sense of like obligation or disappointment, or I don't know if resentment is, maybe that's too strong a word, but like if we see something that we haven't played in a while, we feel very differently about it, and that affects the passion a bit.
Well, and Joe, you had a really good video a while back about decks that you completed and then yeeted, as you were very clever to say. And that video was really, really good and really helpful for folks, I think.
Thanks.
Because you gave yourself permission to go through the process of, and all that work. It does take work sometimes when you're building a deck and all the thought that goes into it. You built it, you took the time to put it together beyond just building it, and then you took the time to play the deck. That was a huge time investment, and you thought, this just wasn't for me, or whatever the reasons are that you might give up on a deck after playing it once. I think it takes a lot of courage just to do that, because people get so easily attached. They put all that time commitment into it. Well, now I have to get so much time commitment out of it. And that's just not the case with every single deck.
Right. The lessons that you learn even from that experience mean that it isn't wasted time. I think we feel like we have to keep those decks because we don't want those things to feel like a waste. Even if you take them apart, that doesn't mean that they were a waste. The lessons that you learned from them are still very important.
100%.
And 100%. Going through other videos we've done, I mean, Dana and I track our games. Part of it is about, making sure our win percentages aren't crazy high. That's a huge ingredient for me. I don't want decks that are punching too hard. But another part of it was holding myself accountable with which decks am I actually playing. And I realized, I have this Elegith deck that I have played 0 times in a year and a half. So why is it there? It's just an expensive paperweight at that point. And this year, I'm having the same conversation with my Rayhan and Ishai deck.
Wow, okay.
Which I love that deck. I loved building that deck, but I haven't played it in like a year and a half. So what am I doing?
You've had that deck for a long time too. So I'm curious, but also I have decks too. Like you mentioned your Rayhan and Ishai deck. My Vivictus has Mahdi the Dire deck. I've had that around, since Vivictus was originally previewed, I want to say.
Yeah, you've had it for ages.
That was something that I've been playing that deck for forever, but also in the same vein, I don't remember the last time I played it. I want to say, so we just got back from MagicCon Chicago. I think it was the last time we were at MagicCon Chicago last year that was the last time I even brought it to an event, much less played it.
Yeah. And at a certain point, is it time to do the Marie Kondo thing of just like, all right, thank you for the joy that you gave me. But since I'm not playing you right now, let me focus on the things that are giving me joy now in the current moment as well.
Yeah.
I think that makes sense. And that doesn't mean that you're disrespecting Vivictus, who would be very angry if you were to disrespect them.
Very, very.
If anything, I think there's sort of some appreciation there. Just like, that's right. You learned well from me. Go forth, young Padawan.
I like that point, Joey. And one example of this specifically that I think I can kind of narrate too. So I have a Narset Enlightened Exile deck. I built that deck doing Commander Limited with a bunch of friends. You were there at this event, and it was so much fun to get to do this thing where everybody, we cracked open a bunch of packs. We did kind of a Commander Sealed type of event together. And to me, keeping that deck together was kind of a way of honoring the memory of that week that we all got to spend together. But I need to remember too, just because I don't play that deck anymore or don't even own it, that doesn't mean I didn't have a really good time that week and the memories don't exist.
Yes.
So that's one thing players I would super encourage you all to do is just because you don't have the deck from a certain event anymore doesn't mean that those memories aren't going to last.
Yeah, precisely that. You don't need a picture of every place that you visited on vacation to remember those places fondly.
You just need a picture of the food. Just the food.
A picture of the food. Wow. Well, and for another point here, and this is more of a practical point, when you have a whole lot of decks, you're also spreading your staples too thin. And that's another big thing to mention here. If anything, people will probably be like, why didn't you mention the monetary cost that is involved with having a whole lot of decks? We just have to acknowledge that too. I like building Golgari decks. It's really fun for me, but I only have so many Golgari lands to put into various mana bases. I can't keep buying heroic interventions to put into decks. At a certain point, just keeping a lot of decks around is expensive as heck.
Yeah, that adds up really quickly. And I know that there's a lot of players out there who have found shortcuts around that. Whether I know a very common practice, Joe, and I don't know if you know anybody who's done this, where they have the one copy and they either move it in between different decks whenever they're playing, or they just proxy in a bunch of different decks. I know that's for sure. Some strategies out there that people have put into place.
Yeah.
For me, though, man, having Game Changers has been such a nice little change for me because it takes a lot of pressure off me needing to have multiple copies of all these. I don't need a Cyclonic Rift for every blue deck anymore because, well, this one's bracket 2. I can't even play Cyclonic Rift in there anymore. That's something that's helped me a ton on this aspect because now I know I don't need to have a bunch of $40 cards laying around.
Yeah, that is definitely helpful. Distributing your power levels can be a really nice way of avoiding those potentials. But even then, it is still expensive, even when you're building budget decks.
Oh, it still is.
And well, connected to this also, it isn't just that sometimes those things can be expensive if you are buying all those cards, but it can also be taxing on your mind.
Yeah.
I do kind of have a fear of like, I don't want to feel like I'm only upgrading this deck because I'm supposed to.
Yep.
I know set fatigue is a thing that we've talked about a whole lot, but when you have 20 decks and a new set comes out every 2 months or so,
it's so hard.
Having more decks means that you have to pay even more attention every single preview season. And Matt, this is our job to do that, and we're still exhausted by it.
Yeah, we are still exhausted by it too. Well, and on the set fatigue note, I absolutely have the problem where sets are coming out so often and the pressure to update decks. So even if I am updating half my decks that I have, so I say I'm updating 10 decks actively every single set, that's a lot. And I still have cards just because of how often I get to play. There are cards that I'm looking to cut from decks I haven't even gotten a chance to cast yet.
Right.
There are cards just because it's so hard to keep up with so many stinking decks, and I don't even always get a chance to play them after I make those updates.
Even if you're not adding any cards to a deck, the feeling of, well, I got to look through that set to see whether there is anything, even that can be draining, especially if you repeat it for every single deck in your collection. And if you slim things down a little bit, maybe you won't feel quite as worried about having decks that feel, quote, incomplete. And I think for me also a big part of this is like being honest, when new cards come out that would be good in your deck, are you getting those cards because you are excited about them, or are you getting them because you feel obligated to do so? Like that's the thing that I have to confront about myself a little bit whenever new sets come out and I look at my decks and I'm like, this process doesn't feel like quite as passionate as I usually am when I'm building decks. It feels like I'm going through some motions instead.
And going through the motions is the last thing you want to do when it comes to this, because this is a hobby. This is something we should be doing. We should be doing for fun. It doesn't always get to become that, especially, Joe, you mentioned this is our job, but it absolutely should be something you look forward to doing. And so if you're struggling, maybe it's more of a burnout thing than anything, but my goodness, if you are not looking forward to updating your decks, then maybe that's something that just you need to kind of reevaluate. And surely the quantity of decks you're trying to update could certainly be a factor.
And a thing that I've heard a lot from folks, like when we meet them in person at conventions and stuff like that, A lot of folks seem really energized by the amount of passion that I have towards some of my decks, such as my Commander deck, where every card has the word Commander on it, or my Babala Saga deck. That's one that I hear a lot from people, where they're very... I've heard people say that they're really moved by that, which is moving for me in return. It's one of the nicest compliments that I've ever gotten from folks. I'm really touched by that. When I make changes to that deck, I want to feel the thrill and excitement of that. And if I have a whole lot of decks and I've gone through those motions in every single one of them, I would worry a little bit about like, well, I guess I got to update it. Like that being the feeling that characterizes some of my upgrades. That's not what I want. And to me, a solution to potentially try and circumvent that potentiality would be to like, let me slim things down a little bit. Let me get rid of some decks that it turns out I'm not playing a whole ton of so that I can focus on what is really properly bringing me joy.
Yeah, there's only so much emotional bandwidth that we really can put into, especially any given set. And so finding ways to manage your relationship with how you update your decks and how often. I know for me, doing it quarterly, just, okay, there's 3 sets that have come out. I'm going to look at everything. I'm going to do a new Scryfall search. That's helped me a ton, but absolutely cutting down the number of decks to distribute your time and attention to will absolutely help with that too, because then you're not trying to babysit over so many things that, especially when you don't get to play enough, you're going to make all these changes. You're going to spend a lot of time and money, again, updating this deck, but then you're not going to actually get to play it. That's the worst feeling in the world to me is you spend a bunch of time updating a deck and then you just don't play it.
And like, let's be honest, on this discussion point about like, it could potentially burn out your passion here, the way that you engage with and the way that you play a deck that you have a lot of affection for is frankly pretty different to the way that you engage with or play a deck that you are playing because you're afraid to dismantle it. Those are different. Those are different flow states, you know?
Very much. And I definitely have fallen into both camps of that too. I don't think it's unfair to say that I felt pressure to keep a deck, and maybe it felt like I was betraying something almost, but definitely you want to honor the passion that went into building the deck in the first place. That's something that you can't take away just because you only kept the deck for so long or only got to play so many games with. That's kind of an arbitrary thing to me that people kind of put on themselves. I would feel kind of weird saying I'm going to build a deck and I have to play 7 games with it to make sure it's worth it. That feels weird to me.
Yeah, it hopefully should feel more organic or more 100%. Intuitive.
Yeah.
And it is an organic thing. When we like notice the decks that we are picking for game nights or that we're bringing to conventions or whatever, and we notice the ones that we're grabbing more often than others, well, then we should have a hard conversation about the ones that we're not instinctively grabbing. Paying attention to your own organic reactions is the whole point of this episode. And to hammer one last point on this too, when we're talking about like, yes, it spreads out your staples super thin. It could make you a little bit fatigued when new sets are coming around, and this all could lead to potentially you being a little bit burnt out on the game if you have all of these things and you're spread thin there. I want to like basically bring up that like we made the case like your expensive staples could be spread too thin, but sometimes your pet cards end up being spread too thin when you have a lot of decks too. Like your favorite synergies, you don't get to see them as much either, and I think that is recursive. Feeds back into that loop of contributing to a potential burnout, which is not good. Dislike button, you know? So like that's one final thing that I think is important to note about the potential of burning out passion here, is because when you have a whole lot of decks, you're not seeing some of the stuff that made you smile in the first place. And I want to make sure that you see the stuff that makes you smile.
And one helpful exercise that didn't apply to Magic directly, but I've found a way to translate it over, is a friend of mine and mentor said, if you say you have 100 units of time to budget out and you write down all the things you want to do in that time, and for Magic specifically, sit down and say you have 100 games that you want to play. Budget out how many times you want to play any given deck in your current rotation, and then go back after those 100 games are played and find how many times you actually played any given deck to see if you actually lived up to what you wanted to do. I think you'll end up finding that the time you wanted to budget for any given deck didn't always necessarily come in line with what you're finding yourself enjoying playing and trying to play more of.
Yeah.
And if there's a huge discrepancy in a deck that you wanted to play, you budgeted 10% of your games towards, but you only played it 3 or 4 times, maybe that's a sign that you need to take a look at if you even need to keep this deck anymore because you're not playing it as much as you say you want to.
All right, Matt, we've hit a lot of points about making the case that, y'all out there, we all probably have too many decks, and we want to have that hard conversation and confront some of the truths about having a whole lot of decks in our roster. But we don't want to just focus on that part. We also want to focus on the many amazing benefits that exist when you do go through the act of taking decks apart and dismantling them. I think that'll be more in the second half of this show, because right now we've hit our midpoint challenge the stats segment. There's so much data on EDHREC that we don't always agree with, so let's take a quick pause to challenge some of those statistics. We all love to upgrade and optimize our commander decks, but why not upgrade and optimize your nutrition? Factor has chef-made, gourmet, dietitian-approved meals ready to heat and eat in just 2 minutes. Longtime listeners know that my husband and I have enjoyed Factor for years now. Heck, we just got our new box of meals a couple hours ago today. And now there's a bunch of stuff like a chicken and mushroom tetrazzini or a smoky Gouda chicken just waiting in the fridge for me. And that one only has 570 calories and 44 grams of protein, which is perfect for me. Stats like that have been extremely helpful for me in my weight loss goals over the years, and those Factor meals arriving fresh and fully prepared are perfect for our busy lifestyles. And Factor even has more meal options that you can pick to tailor to your goals too, like Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, or Keto. Reach your goals this year with ingredients you can trust and convenience that can't be beat. Eat smart with Factor. Get started at factormeals.com/factorpodcast and use code FACTORPODCAST to get 50% off your first box plus free shipping. That's code FACTORPODCAST at factormeals.com/factorpodcast to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box.
All right, Joey, I'm going to start us off because I've got a pretty spicy one that came to us from a listener, actually, that I'm very excited to talk about today. So Jacob L. sent us an email, which all of you can do at EDHRECast@gmail.com, and said, I have a challenge for y'all. Ripples of Potential is an incredible phase-out board protection in my Sophia Dogged Detective deck, and surprisingly, only 43 of the 3,000 Sophia decks run the card, and it does so well in protecting my buff dogs. So I didn't even realize that Ripples of Potential was a card. I completely missed it when it was being previewed, and it's absolutely fantastic. So it's 1 and a blue for an instant that says Proliferate, then choose any number of permanents you control that had a counter put on them this way. Those permanents phase out, which means they basically don't exist until the beginning of your next turn. And the way this plays around in Sophia is you get to proliferate by sacrificing artifacts, putting +1/+1 counters on everything. So more often than not, your Sophia deck, which if you look at the typical deck, is full of dogs that are going to have +1/+1 counters on them, all are going to get phased out thanks to Ripples of Potential. This is a really, really cool synergy. Jacob also goes on to say, if you have a +1/+1 counters deck, or even a deck that just cares about counters in general, this card is a house, and I would consider putting it in your deck, and it's still even under $10 at the moment. And Jacob, you are absolutely correct. This card is so stinking good. I could see this being a mainstay in Miss Bumbleflower decks, where you're able to cast spells, put counters on everything, then proliferate. I know, Joey, you and I have a friend who plays a pretty mean Miss Bumbleflower deck.
Oh, so good.
I probably shouldn't be talking about this card actually right now, because
yeah, giving them ideas.
Our friend is just going to house us with it. But yeah, Ripples of Potential is a powerhouse of a card. For less than $5, it's in 48,000 decks. Ripples of Potential has a lot of potential to just save your bacon so many times. So yes, if you need a quality protection spell in decks that care about counters, give Ripples of Potential a call. Thank you so much, Jacob, for your email too.
Terrific challenge. I love it. All right, I'm going to move on to my challenge here, which I got to talk about Temet Noctamun's Will, an Esper zombie precon commander that came out very recently, already has 4,000 plus decks to its name. This thing's so terrific. 5 mana Esper zombie wizard. It's a 4/4 with vigilance and menace. Whenever you attack, you draw a card and then discard a card. Whenever you draw a card, zombies you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. Oh, it's spicy. Like the card Knowledge is Power on a commander and it cares about zombies. I love 100% of the things that are happening here. But there's a card that we've challenged in the past as being kind of an underplayed, cool, combat-y draw spell that I think really belongs in Temet decks. Keep Watch is currently only showing up in 14% of the 4,000 plus Temet decks that have been built so far. Keep Watch is a 3 mana blue instant. Draw a card for each attacking creature.
It's good. That's good.
That can be really cool when, your opponent, Matt Morgan, has an Avenger of Zendikar attacking you with like 12 Saproling things, and then you draw 12 cards for 3 mana. So it's already cool for that reason. So it's great as a defensive tool because you can draw so many cards, and then maybe you'll find a removal spell or even more stuff. Like, it's a cool surprise trick when enemies are attacking. Very versatile card. card. But here it's even more versatile than we thought, because if you attack with, say, 6 zombies, your commander loots a card. Your zombies will get, a +1 off of that. And then you keep watch on yourself and you draw 6 more cards and then give them a further +6/+6 mid-combat, maybe even after people have declared blockers. Keep Watch is an amazing card already. It is cracked in this deck. Get Keep Watch into Temet immediately. This card is fantastic. This commander is ludicrous. I really love this synergy, and I hope it shows up a little bit more for that Zombo man.
Yeah, there's so many fun interactions with this new Temet. I'm very curious what other Keep Watch type of effects there are, because turning these into overrun effects is nothing to be joked around with.
I draw cards and it kills you. Like, I punch you with my brain is fantastic.
Yeah, pretty much.
All right, Matt. In the first half of the episode, we talked about we probably have too many decks. Let's confront that about ourselves. But here in the second half, I would love for us to talk about the many benefits of taking decks apart. One of the first ones I want us to jump to is definitely that when you take a deck apart, or when you maybe even start to try and take a deck apart, you really find out how it is you truly feel about that deck. Like, if you take that deck apart and then after a week you're like, dang, I really miss it, then boom, you have your answer, and you're probably even more passionate about that deck in the first place. So kind of challenging it a little bit reinforced how much you really love it, and I think that's a very valuable experience.
Well, for sure. I like the experience of taking it apart, and then again, if you unless you're just selling your collection, there's really no risk in doing this because you still have the cards. It's not like the cards just disappear whenever you take a deck apart. If you sort your collection better than I do, which is pretty easy to do actually, because I do so bad at it. But yeah, you still have those cards laying around. So even though they're not explicitly in a deck box altogether, sleeved and everything, you still are able to put these decks back together. So taking a deck apart and just kind of letting it be for a couple days absolutely is kind of a heat check when it comes to how do I actually feel about this deck? Can I live without it or not? And I mean, it's Magic cards, we all can, but knowing that it's still there and feeling the urge to play it, it's such a good way to measure that and have a good response for it.
100%. And if you take a deck apart and you don't feel the need to rebuild it, you have your answer there too, a little bit. When I permanently took apart some of my, I had a Feather deck, I had a Group Hug deck, I had Cardour, when I took those decks apart, I did not miss them for very long, but I did appreciate what they taught me even more once they were actually gone. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. Being able to kind of close the book or move on to the next chapter of your Magic adventure. Yeah. There's definitely something to be said for, now I get to process this, and now I get to kind of document everything that I learned about it. So I totally get where you're coming from, Joey, because I've had to do the same things in and outside of Magic, even for myself.
I like the way that you phrase that. It does feel like you can finally move on to the next chapter because you've properly given closure to the previous thing.
Closure, that's a fantastic way to put it. Yep.
Yeah, and you might not have that closure until you actually take that action. And getting that sense of closure is good, as you're saying, in the normal, regular life, not just in Magic. And kind of related to this is a practice that, Matt, I don't know if you've done this before, but to kind of give another minor example of what this point can be, have you ever done that thing where when you're stuck between two difficult choices, you flip a coin? And it's not about you go with whatever the result is, but it's when you see the result, you pay attention to your reaction to that result. For instance, I'll flip the coin and it's a tails, and then I immediately notice, I'm disappointed by that. Oh, well, now I have my answer. Now I know how I feel. Yeah. That's kind of the technique I think we're applying here. When you take the deck apart, if you notice that you're disappointed or you notice that you don't miss it, now you have your answer. This is a version of doing that flip a coin trick to really, as you said, heat check where you're at with these decks. And that's kind of an image I wanted to paint about a good benefit that can come from here in addition to the closure.
Sure. No, I can totally respect that thought process. So I don't do that a lot with Magic, but I understand the feeling that you have. You have a kind of a guttural reaction to the possibility even of anything. When it comes to Magic, I'm kind of a Chris Traeger when it comes to, so if anybody's seen Parks and Rec, they ask him, well, would you rather have a boy or a girl? And he's like, well, I would love a boy, but I also love a girl. But I would love a boy. But yeah, I totally would love having a girl too. And so he keeps it's the same feeling either way. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of like that when it comes to my Magic decks. I would love having a new deck, but also I still will enjoy the old decks. But I still would like a new deck, but also I still like these old decks.
There you go.
And so for me, I'm really just, a good way to put it, I'm just happy to be here is kind of my approach when it comes to a lot of these, which is why having these conversations like this, Joey, is so good for me, because I have to go a little bit beyond that thought process of I'm just happy to have these decks, or I'm happy to not have this deck anymore, and actually putting rubber to the road. It's very easy for me, Joey, to talk hypothetically about taking decks apart, but actually getting to the like carrying it out and taking the deck apart, unsleeving the decks. That's where my biggest challenge comes from.
That's honestly a huge thing. I'm afraid in this episode that we're doing a lot of talk the talk. I am going to try and hold myself accountable here.
Yeah.
We're like, all right, I mentioned I haven't played Reyhan or Nishai for a long time. Let me actually go through this process of taking that apart and then seeing how I feel about it, because I want to walk that walk as well. Another point of really great benefit that I think can come from this, we discussed burnout a whole lot as like one of the consequences of having potentially too many decks, and how burnout can sometimes be a symptom that indicates to you that you have too many decks. A benefit of taking apart a bunch of decks is that it can reignite a lot of that passion. If you've been a little burnt out by the game, stripping everything down and starting again from a pretty clean slate, I think helps. It means that you might be able to find your way to those things that you originally loved about Magic and about EDH in the first place when you go back to some of those basic starting points, you know?
Yeah, and it's something that goes back to what I said earlier about emotional capital. You only have so much that you can spend. And so when you're trying to spend it on 20 different decks, 30 different decks, you only have so much that you can allocate out to every individual one. Whereas if you cut it down to 8 decks, 10, 15, whatever that looks like for you, you have the same amount of energy and emotional capital to spend on those, but each one gets a little bit more because there's less competition to take that attention away from it, because just by virtue of having fewer decks in existence, you can give so much more to those around it still.
And I think it also can provide a little bit of a jumping off point or a little bit more fuel for the brewing process once more. The amount of motivation that I have to brew decks when I have 20 of them is low. But if I only had 2 decks, my motivation to brew is higher again. It makes me more excited to get tinkering once more. And so having those reset points of actually taking things down and then trying some restarts, I think is a way of like kind of kickstarting my own brain engine in terms of deck brewing. I don't know if this metaphor is a little bit too tortured, but yeah, it is a thing that I'm able to like play with my own excitements level there. Because I noticed that when I have a whole lot of decks, I don't have a lot of motivation to keep tinkering all of the time. And I like the tinkering. I like the brewing stage. And so maybe having a hard reset encourages me to do more of the tinkering when I have fewer total decks on my mind.
Yeah, in what you said, Joey, too, it kind of goes into our next point here of just you have a better perspective about what you're expecting from any given deck and what you want to be doing moving forward too. And just having a reset of your perspective, zooming out is such a helpful tool. You take a step away from the situation that you've been in for however long to kind of reset the ground rules and that base level expectation. That is such a valuable tool, not just with Magic, but just in general. And so being able to apply that to your Magic decks, you zoom out, okay, I have the things that I can't live without. Say I have my Jetmir deck, I have my Omnath deck, and everything else is kind of up in the air. And that gives me a lot of freedom for myself I have the new perspective of nothing's really sacred and protected anymore because I've given myself that freedom to zoom out and detach a little bit from all of those decks I have in existence.
Totally. Nothing is going to give me a better perspective of what, say, my Goad deck was doing than it not being there anymore. And when I have to like re-engage with the idea of Goad from a completely fresh start, I'm not carrying the same biases or the same traditions of what I was doing previously. And that is probably going to get me more in tune with what were the strengths and weaknesses of what my old deck was doing in the first place. And if I do end up rebuilding it, then having that hard reset as a moment to be able to zoom out, as you said, that allows me to address those weaknesses or strengths even more, or to lean into or lean away from certain things. Like, it prevents us from being caught up in a rut of what we were already doing previously.
Yeah.
And that's that new perspective that you're able to unlock by trying out a hard reset.
Yeah.
If I have my Virtus and Gorm deck, which I also don't play very much, I haven't played it for like a year, and eventually I do play it in 8 months, what's the difference between that experience versus taking apart that Virtus and Gorm deck, and then in 8 months, I get the hankering to put it back together again and to play play it again. The difference is some amount of effort to deconstruct and reconstruct it, sure, but the difference also is not spending those months feeling weird or guilty about not playing it, spending months looking at every set trying to figure out if I should get new cards to put into that deck, and if I do eventually rebuild it, having a fresh perspective on how to make that deck tick. Those are pretty different experiences, and in some cases, one of them might be healthier than the other.
Well, and Joey, I'm curious too if you find yourself doing the same thing that I do, is when you take a deck apart, maybe it's your only deck in a certain strategy or archetype, whatever. If you find yourself kind of getting away from bad habits that you got with that deck, or you were adhering to, well, I've always been playing this type of Aristocrats deck, and now you have a chance to kind of try it again with a new lens, with a new perspective of, well, I have all these other cards that I never really gave a chance to either.
Yes. Yeah, totally. That's why, that's how I encourage myself to try out cards like Keep Watch that I mentioned in Challenges Stats earlier in the first place. And not only that, but sometimes when you do that, it could clue you in that maybe you'll try that similar theme, but with a brand new commander this time. Because maybe you were stuck in the rut, just like in terms of what was in your command zone. But having taken it apart and maybe wanting to give it a try again, not only will there be the new cards that you might want to, you didn't give airtime to previously, but there might be another commander who could prove something or help you learn something else to you about that theme as well.
Yeah.
By already having a +1/+1 counters deck, even though I don't play it very much, and therefore not paying attention to new +1/+1 counter commander options because I already have one myself, how many of those commanders have I missed out on that I could have given a chance to if I didn't have a +1 counters deck already camping that spot in my brain,
100%.
So yeah, it is really unlocking new perspectives.
Yeah, having the perspective of, well, I've always done it this way, so I should just keep doing it this way. That's never worked in any aspect of life ever. And so,
agreed.
I'm glad that you and I are on the same page then when it comes to giving yourself permission to try something new, even if it's related to something you've done before. Just getting rid of old habits and old bad habits, especially, so valuable to have when it comes to your Magic brewing.
Plus, let's be honest, we're better brewers now than we were when we first built those decks.
I don't know about that, but I'm glad that's the case for you. For me, not so much. I'm still turning things sideways, so let's not give ourselves too much credit.
That's so funny. But I just mean, if you're taking a deck out of what could be called a state of inertia, if you're taking it away from that, a new lens might mean that you're able to remake that deck even better the next time around. Basically, I think what I'm trying to say is that if you never engage with the question of taking a deck apart, I think you're losing the chance to challenge yourself in a way that could help you grow into being a better Magic player. Though the person I was when I first built a deck is not the person I am today, and I do want to give the person I am today a chance to throw their hat in that ring from that initial stage of brewing something, because I think I might be better at it now. Or at least there are new things I've learned now that I will be able to access better than I did in the past.
Well, and I love that point that you have, Joy, because it kind of goes into my next point that I had, where you kind of give yourself permission to focus on what you enjoy doing the most.
Yeah.
When you have a good, solid reset. Like you said, Joey, I have more experience. I have more knowledge than I did 10 years ago. And so why can't I do that with my deck brewing process? And I've given myself chances, for example, to try different decks, try different strategies that I'm not familiar with, but I can always just come back to what I actually enjoy. And I don't have to push myself all the time. I can have those comfortable picks that I get to come back to. That's one thing I would say I should give myself credit more for in the past year or so, because I've just gotten to lean into, okay, I know what I want to do. I want to do the big, powerful things. I don't need to always be challenging myself. I can have these comfort decks that I just come back to and get to enjoy, because it feels like that warm, fuzzy blanket that everybody loves. It's on the couch.
And for you, there are actually, I think, several decks in your roster currently that you're really eyeing as being potentially part of your chopping block, more or less, right?
Yeah, for sure.
You mentioned Vevictus as an earlier example, but I think that there are probably a couple of others that you've really been like, are these detracting from what I'm after? And will these therefore go so that I can focus on the things that I'm enjoying most?
Yeah, there definitely are. And there's even decks, again, that people have kind of come to associate with me sometimes. My Kyler deck, that's my green-white humans. I've had that deck. I bought it as a pre-con. I've tuned it up. I've changed it over the course of time. And I've played a lot of really explosive turns with it. But I also just don't find myself reaching for it anymore.
Yeah.
I don't find myself really jonesing to pull out this humans deck. Again, I don't remember the last time that I brought it to an event even, much less to a game night with my friends. It's got to be at least a year and a half, if not longer than that. that I've really gone for that deck. And it's a deck that I love. I've talked about it a lot because I've gotten to learn a lot from it. But at the same time, but it also doesn't have that comfort feeling either, which is why for me, it's in this weird state where I need to stop being so attached to it and feel like there's a sunk cost into me owning it.
Yeah.
And just enjoy that I had it while I did.
Yes. Yeah. Sunk cost is a really good way to describe a lot of this, especially.
It is a fallacy for a reason. Yeah.
And exactly right. It is a fallacy. And we do, I think, feel caught up in that moment we described earlier of like, I put so much energy into this. Would taking it apart mean that I wasted that time? And no, it super doesn't. If anything, it cements those lessons that you learned and can help you get that closure we were talking about earlier. And I want to also, I guess, linger a little bit on that point that you mentioned about people do associate you with that Kyler deck in some way. We do all out there have like some certain signature decks that in our play groups we're really well known for. And there is probably an increased difficulty with the idea of taking apart a deck that you are well known for, or a deck that feels especially unique to you.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is, I think, a point that makes even the act of dismantling it feel more daunting in a way, which
it absolutely does. Yeah.
And I totally relate to that. There are decks where I'm just like, no, I feel so associated with this that I could never, right? But I don't want to be controlled by that daunting feeling. I want to make sure that my passions are what's actually driving my motivations here. So like, that's why I think it's important to confront some of those and not to feel as though there are certain things we can't ever touch. We should actually still be okay with engaging with these. Even if we don't end up taking something apart, we should feel encouraged to make sure that we do have those hard conversations with ourselves. So with you taking apart a Kyler deck or a Vivictus deck or a Valduk deck, I think is also one that like, I've associated that with you for a really long time and is one that you're not playing. Well, we should make sure that we engage with the practical reality of that and not hold fast to older associations, because you should have the ability to make new associations in your deck building.
Yeah, I like the way that you put that, Joey, where just because we have old associations doesn't mean that we can't establish new ones either. I still love Valduk, but I also have an Arden and Kedis deck now that came from the ashes of Valduk, because I did find myself not playing Valduk a whole lot, still had it kind of in some form, but I pillaged it for something that I would. And so kind of in a way, it got rebirthed into a new deck that I got to then learn and appreciate all over again. And so that's something that I definitely think gets underrated when it comes to people pillaging decks and turning into something new. You get to reestablish your relationship with those cards all over again.
Totally. And like find new things to do with those themes and such like that. You play around, you'll learn more when you're playing in those new sandboxes. And connected to all of this, we just talked about some things that can feel really daunting because we do have so much attachment to them. But the biggest benefit that I think comes from the actual act of dismantling your decks is that this is a version of conquering fears. I know that sounds silly to apply to cardboard, but a lot of these can feel like really big leaps. Like fully dismantling every single deck that you have. That sounds like a lot. Like I couldn't do the Danshin thing, I don't think. But that is commitment. I probably couldn't do it just because of the time.
Yeah, time management alone, I don't know if I could commit to that. But I like the idea of being intentional about reevaluating something in a very real and tangible way that is more than just, I think I would like to do this, or I think I would like to not do this.
And what it is, like, it is a daunting thing. It feels like a whole lot, but practicing daunting tasks is good for you in life. And this is a very safe version of practicing something that feels like a big deal. And that, I think, is a huge benefit of actually taking some of your decks apart, or lots of your decks apart. You're making a big move, and as people, we do need to be comfortable with making big moves in life, and this could be a way of conquering the intimidating feeling that we occasionally run into. I think that that's just a good emotional thing to practice as a person, let alone as a player.
Man, Joey, I did not think we were going to get this heavy when it comes to real life applications from a Magic the Gathering podcast, but here we are. But I absolutely do agree.
Here we are.
There's something to be said for you kind of have to confront fears when it comes to addressing what do I have, like what comfort does this deck still have for me, and does that still apply, or can I take the deck apart and it turns out I don't need that stuffed animal anymore because that's when I was a baby and now I'm an adult. That doesn't mean you can't still appreciate having it around though, and the memories that you got to form with it.
Yeah, basically a point that I think is to kind of crystallize this whole idea, to kind of put all these stars into a constellation here, I do honestly feel that a lot of us end up keeping decks out of nostalgia rather than out of passion.
Sure.
And throughout all of this,
Guilty.
Right? Yeah. And we think of this as we're getting rid of a deck, quote unquote, but I think it is actually, at the end of the day, more accurate to think of this as we're afraid of something changing. And that's really what the point of this episode is like to practice ways of not being afraid of a change, especially if it feels like a big change. Practicing this in a game of Magic can make you more equipped to deal with some of the stuff that happens in the real life. And I think that's an amazing thing for a game to be able to bring you as a benefit. So that's why I want to encourage folks out there to potentially give it a try, because that is a huge, huge gain that you could get.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess one question that I would ask us as we're kind of starting to wrap up and getting to the end of the show is, when you think about it super hard and you get to kind of rolling everything over, how many decks do you actually feel truly are forever decks for you? Is it something that you think half your decks are, or maybe is it just a couple decks for you? Because I know the more that I've thought about that, I don't know how many I truly actually do have.
Yeah, I think I said maybe earlier that my number might be like 3 or 4, that I'm just like, oh, I'm actively disappointed by the idea that I don't have those in my life anymore. But that is a smaller number than I think I would have expected.
Sure.
When I was like initially just like,
sure.
Oh, like just kind of like turning this topic idea over in my head. I was like, oh, it's probably, probably maybe half of my decks do I feel like, oh, I got to keep those. And then when I actually got down to brass tacks and looked through my Architect lists, I was like, oh, it's a really tiny number. And that's okay. And like you were saying at the top of the episode, if I take some of these apart and I don't end up rebuilding them, that's also okay. And
that's also, that's still fine.
And the other doors that it opens up for me in terms of like generating excitement for me to consider experimenting with new stuff that I wouldn't have bothered with when I had 16 or 20 decks already. Even opening those doors for a small amount of time, just for a little while, is also still really good for me to dabble and then recenter myself with what it is that is actually bringing me the most amount of joy in this game. But step one was getting in touch with the fact that like, oh yeah, my forever decks, probably only 3 or 4 of them. Is the number similar for you, or do you think it is higher?
I would say there's, at this point, 3 decks sounds like a good number of forever decks. Yeah. I think I would have to go through and reevaluate and just give a critical look. But also there's some sense too for me that I may have my Emil deck, for example. That deck has gone through a lot of different iterations. So it's never going to be truly that Emil deck, because it was my Miri Weatherlight Duelist deck, and then it was my Tristani Discordant deck.
Right.
I don't think that the deck has ever existed in the same form for too long. I've always had a Selesnya deck because I like that color combination. It's just what I appreciate doing in Magic. So I will probably always have a Selesnya deck that is functioning, tuned up, does very well. Whatever that form may take. That said, I think 3 is where my brain goes to with how many decks are truly forever decks.
That Emil example, I think, is actually perfect because, yes, that is a deck that you have taken apart and reconstructed over time, and it has different commanders. And that's another thing that we can really get caught up on, is we think of the deck sometimes as just like the commander. This is my Wilheld deck, but really it is a zombie deck, and a zombie deck can take many, many forms. Another example to kind of cement this is probably, if you know Megan from Infinitokens fame, she's such an amazing, fantastic gummy bear of a person, and her signature deck is not about the individual commander. The commander of that deck changes a lot, but the point of the deck is to make as many different types of tokens as she can. The soul of that deck is the thing to actually focus on, not just the commanders. So for you, the soul of the Selesnya deck, the Soul-Lesnya deck, if you will, is the thing to focus on there. And that's a good way for us to make sure that we're in tune with what a forever deck actually means.
Yeah, for sure. And just to prove that I'm actually, like we said, putting rubber to the road, I'm in my Architect folder right now. I'm looking at my Ovika Enigma Goliath deck and my Mishra deck that was all old border. I changed the descriptions to say retired decks. I am trying to actually put my thoughts into actions here.
Heck yeah. I think the way the form it'll take for me is that For me, it's about the physical act of taking things out of the sleeves and sorting them again. That's probably where some of my attention will go. So that's something that probably either tonight or this weekend I'll try and spend some time doing to get. There's something that feels a little bit like maybe ritualistic or gets into a Zen state of mind there, and that's a thing that I'll probably, the way it'll manifest for me, because it can manifest for a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. But a really good practice and way to hold yourself accountable, Matt. I heckin' love that. I hope you hold me accountable too.
I'm just doing what I can, and I'm sure that we'll do some follow up here in the future too about what decks did we actually end up taking apart, because it's easy to, like we said, to just say things about what we want to do, but actually getting to do them, that's the hard part.
Here's the hardest one though. What are we going to do about Dana? How are we?
He'll be fine. He'll get over it.
He's got more than either of us. That man brews a whole lot. I feel like having this conversation with Dana is going to be really, really tough. But I think it's not for us to say. It's for him to decide.
The amount of decks that he has, though, if he just gets rid of like half of his decks, his Architect page is going to load so much faster just because it's not trying to load so many decks.
That man has... we can't even get him to only bring like 5 decks to a convention.
He even said on the show, he's like, I'm only going to bring 5 or 6 decks, and then he brought 12.
Yes, right. It's wild. So it'll be a tough talk with Dana, but we will try and have that talk too. But really, this is about having a conversation with your own personal self. That's the jokes aside. This is sometimes a hard conversation to have, but it's an important one to have. And listeners, we hope it's been helpful for you out there, and that has encouraged some healthy practices for you as well.
Yeah.
With that, though, I think we're going to call this episode to a close. Matt, if our listeners would like to get in touch with us here on the podcast, where is it that they can find you, dude?
So you can find me on pretty much any social media platform at Mathimus55. That's MATHIMUS55. And don't forget, we are proud to work with Dragon Shield. That we're bringing some very unique offerings to the table here in the near future. So make sure you click on the link below. That'll take you right to Dragon Shield's page to keep an eye on all the new happenings that are going on over there, because there are some very, very exciting things in the works.
And you can find me everywhere online, from Instagram to Blue Sky at Joseph M. Schultz. And you can find the cast online at EDHRECast everywhere. Plus, if you've got a question for us or perhaps a challenge to stats submission that you'd like to let us know about, you can contact us at EDHRECast@gmail.com. Listeners, we'll be back at you next week with more data and insights. But until next time, remember, EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.